I love hearing how a story ends before I understand how it began. My son called me from the kitchen that morning, his voice completely steady, and said, "Dad, don't come downstairs yet. We need to show you something first." He was 19. He shouldn't have known what he knew, but he did. And by the time I walked down those stairs, everything had already changed. My name is Daniel. I was 31 when my father died, and 32 when I found out my uncle had been stealing from his memory before the body was even cold. My father's name was Raymond. He worked in commercial roofing for 26 years, saved carefully, lived quietly, and left behind a house in Dayton, Ohio, a modest investment account, and a will he'd updated 18 months before his stroke. He wasn't a wealthy man, but what he had, he built with his hands, and he wanted it to go to me and my son, Eli. Eli was 18 when my father died. He'd spent every summer of his childhood at my dad's house. They fished together, fixed things together, watched old westerns together on Saturday nights. When my father had his first minor stroke 2 years before the end, it was Eli who started calling him every Sunday without being asked. My uncle, my father's younger brother, his name was Gordon. He lived 40 minutes away in Springfield, showed up at holidays, borrowed tools he never returned, and spent most of his adult life convinced that he deserved more than he had. He was charming in the way that certain people are charming, easily, effortlessly, and only when they needed something. I didn't distrust Gordon. That was my mistake. I just never trusted him with anything that mattered, which I thought was enough. It wasn't. My father died on a Tuesday in March. The stroke took him fast, which the doctor said was a mercy. I drove to the hospital in 20 minutes and sat with him for 2 hours before they told me he was gone. I called Gordon from the parking garage. He cried, loudly. He said my father was the best man he'd ever known. He said he'd do anything to help with arrangements. I believed him. The funeral was on a Friday. Gordon gave a speech. He told a story about the two of them as kids, stealing apples from a neighbor's tree, their mother furious, their father quietly laughing. He told it well. People nodded. A few people cried. I sat in the front row and felt the particular exhaustion of grief that has no room left for anything else. Gordon stayed after. He helped fold chairs. He stayed until the last car left. He hugged me at the door and said, "Your dad trusted you completely, Daniel. Whatever you need, I'm here." 2 weeks later, I contacted my father's attorney, a woman named Patricia who had handled his affairs for years. She was calm and professional. She walked me through the will. And then she paused. She said, "Daniel, I want to make sure you're aware. There was an amendment filed approximately 6 weeks before your father passed." I told her I wasn't aware of any amendment. She pulled up the document on her screen and turned it toward me. A second page, dated 2 months before my father's death. In it, a portion of the investment account, roughly $40,000, was redirected to Gordon, described in the amendment as compensation for caregiving services rendered during Raymond's illness. My father never mentioned it, not once. I asked Patricia if she had witnessed the signing. She said no. The amendment had been filed through a notary in Springfield, not through her office, not through anyone my father had used before. I drove home feeling like the floor had dissolved under me. $40,000, my father's savings, money he had set aside carefully, slowly, for years. And there was a document, signed and notarized, that said Gordon deserved it. I told myself there had to be an explanation. My father was private sometimes. Maybe he'd felt guilty about something. Maybe Gordon had actually helped in ways I hadn't seen. I turned it over in my mind for 2 days, sitting with it, trying to make it make sense. On the third day, Eli came into the kitchen while I was standing at the counter, not really doing anything, and he looked at me the way young people look at you when they've already figured out the thing you're still trying to figure out. He said, "Dad, I need to show you something." Eli had been going through my grandfather's things. I'd asked him to help me clear out the house. It was too much for me to do alone, and Eli had wanted to be useful in the way grief sometimes makes people want to be useful. He'd been out there on weekends, sorting, labeling, setting things aside. In the second bedroom, in a cardboard box underneath a folding table, he found a laptop. Old, slow, one my father had used for basic things, email, a few saved documents, photos. Eli had the password because my father had given it to him 2 years earlier, so Eli could help him figure out why videos wouldn't load. Eli opened it. He found an email chain. It started 14 months before my father died. Gordon had emailed my father with a proposal. He called it that, a proposal, suggesting that given his help during the illness, he deserved to be included in the estate. My father's reply was 2 sentences. He said he appreciated Gordon's help, but that his will reflected his wishes, and he wasn't planning to change it. Gordon replied the next day. Longer this time. He listed things he claimed to have done. Doctor's appointments, grocery runs, phone calls. He attached nothing. He cited nothing. He said he just wanted what was fair. My father didn't respond to that one. The chain went quiet for 3 months. Then Gordon emailed again, different tone this time. Warmer. He said he understood. He wasn't trying to cause trouble, he just wanted to make sure they were okay. My father wrote back and said they were fine. The last email in the chain was from Gordon. Dated 9 weeks before my father died, after the first major stroke, after my father had lost some mobility on his left side and was having occasional difficulty with concentration and recall. Gordon wrote that he'd arranged for a notary to come to the house the following Thursday. He said it was just to update some paperwork. He said he'd handle everything. He said not to worry about it. My father never replied. Eli sat across from me at the kitchen table and pushed the laptop toward me so I could read it myself. I read it twice. Then I read the date on the last email again. 9 weeks before my father died. After the stroke, after the confusion, after my father had started having days where time moved strangely for him, where he'd forget things he'd said an hour earlier, where he was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. And Gordon had arranged a notary, and somehow a document had been signed, and $40,000 had been redirected. I asked Eli how long he'd had this. He said, 3 days. I wanted to make sure I understood it before I showed you. I didn't want to tell you and be wrong. He was 19. I called Patricia the next morning. I told her what Eli had found. She asked me to forward the emails, which I did. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Daniel, if your father was experiencing cognitive decline at the time of signing, that amendment may not be legally valid." She recommended I contact an elder law attorney immediately. She also said she could reach out to the notary's office to request the signing record. Notes, observations, any documentation of my father's state at the time. I hired the elder law attorney. His name was Brian. He was methodical and careful, and he did not raise his voice or make promises he couldn't keep. He told me these cases were difficult but not impossible. He said the key question was whether my father had the legal capacity to understand what he was signing. He said we would need medical records from around the date of signing. We would need documentation of the cognitive decline. We would need the notary's records. And if possible, we would need any other witnesses who had observed my father's condition during that period. I had all of it. My father's doctors had been careful. There were notes from 2 appointments in the weeks before the amendment was signed. The notes used phrases like mild to moderate cognitive impairment and difficulty with complex decision-making, and patient requires support for understanding multi-step information. Eli, it turned out, had been keeping a journal. He hadn't told me this. He'd started writing things down after the first major stroke because he was scared of forgetting. Scared that the time he had left with his grandfather would blur together and he wouldn't be able to hold on to it. So he'd written small things. What they talked about on Sunday calls. What his grandfather remembered and what he didn't. The Sunday 2 months before he died, when Raymond had called Eli by his own father's name, the name of a man who had been dead for 30 years and hadn't seemed to notice. Eli gave Brian the journal. Brian read it and said very quietly, "This is significant." I did not call Gordon. I want to be clear about that. Every part of me wanted to call him. I wanted to ask him directly, in plain language, what he had done and why. I wanted to hear him explain it. I wanted to give him the chance to say I had it wrong. Brian told me not to. He said if Gordon knew we were building a case, he might move the money, alter records, prepare a defense before we were ready. He said the right move was to let the legal process work. He said, "Let him think everything is fine." So I did. Gordon texted me twice during that period, once to check in, once to ask if I'd gotten everything sorted with the estate. I replied briefly both times. I said things were moving along. I said the paperwork took time. I kept my messages short and factual, and I felt, during those weeks, like I was holding something heavy in both hands that I couldn't set down. Eli asked me once, during that period, whether I was angry. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said yes, but not in the way I expected. I wasn't burning with it. It was colder than that. It was the anger of looking at something you trusted and realizing the shape of it was wrong the whole time, and you just hadn't stood at the right angle to see it. Eli nodded like that made sense to him. He said, "Grandpa trusted everyone because he thought everyone was like him." That was the truest thing anyone said to me that entire year. The notary's records came back 6 weeks later. Brian called me on a Wednesday afternoon and said, the notary made notes. The notary, a woman operating out of a small office in Springfield, had noted that the signing client appeared fatigued and occasionally inattentive. She had noted that the client's companion, Gordon, listed as family, had explained the document on the client's behalf when the client had trouble following along. She had noted that the client signed after a brief rest period. She had not flagged it. She had completed the signing, but she had written it down. Brian said, "In combination with the medical records and your son's journal, I believe we have a strong case for lack of testamentary capacity." He filed the challenge to the amendment. Gordon was served 3 weeks later. He called me within the hour. I was in my car in a parking lot outside a grocery store. My phone rang and Gordon's name was on the screen, and I sat there for a moment and looked at it. Then I answered. He didn't yell right away. He started with confusion. He said there must be a misunderstanding. He said the amendment was Raymond's idea, that he'd brought it up himself, that Gordon had just helped make it happen. He said he'd spent months helping my father, that no one else was there, that I didn't know what those months looked like from the inside. I let him talk. When he stopped, I said, "Gordon." He had a journal. His grandson kept a journal. Silence, I said. Eli wrote down every Sunday call, every visit. He wrote down the Sunday that Dad called him by Grandpa Carl's name. He wrote down the week that Dad asked him 3 times in one conversation what month it was. He wrote all of it down because he loved him and didn't want to forget. More silence. I said, "The notary wrote down that you explained the document for him, because he couldn't follow it himself." Gordon said very quietly, "Daniel." I said, "Don't." I wasn't angry when I said it. I was just done. The court ruled 4 months later. The amendment was invalidated on the grounds of lack of capacity at the time of signing. The $40,000 was returned to the estate and distributed according to the original will, which meant it went to me and, through a trust my father had specifically designated, to Eli's education. Gordon did not appeal. He has not contacted me since the ruling. I don't know what he tells himself now. I don't know what story he's built around it, what version of events lets him sleep. That's not something I spend time on anymore. What I spend time on is Eli. He used part of the trust to start his second year of college without loans. He's studying environmental science. He calls me on Sunday evenings now, which I didn't ask him to do. He just started doing it, the way he started calling his grandfather, because it was the right thing, and he knew it without being told. On one of those Sunday calls, a few months after the ruling, he asked me what I would have done if he hadn't found the laptop. I thought about that honestly, the same way he asked questions, expecting a real answer. I said I probably would have let it go. $40,000 is a lot of money, but fighting it alone felt impossible, and grief has a weight that makes hard things feel heavier. I said I probably would have told myself my father must have had his reasons. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's why I had to show you. Because he didn't have reasons. Someone made the reasons for him when he couldn't think clearly enough to stop them." I didn't say anything for a while. He was right. He was completely right, and the thing about being completely right is it doesn't require anything else to be added to it. My father trusted people because he thought people were basically like him, careful, honest, building something small and real over a long time. He wasn't naive. He just couldn't imagine, up close, a specific betrayal from a person he had known his whole life. I understand that now in a way I didn't before. I also understand something about the people who stay. The ones who write things down not because they expect to need it, but because they love you and don't want to forget. The ones who come downstairs in the morning and say, "Wait, let me show you something first." My father would have been proud of Eli. I know that without needing to say it, but I say it anyway on Sunday evenings, because some things should be said out loud while there's still someone to hear them. The house in Dayton is still in the family. Eli and I spent a weekend there last fall, cleaning out the last few boxes, fixing the porch railing that had been loose for years. We watched a Western on Saturday night, the same channel his grandfather always watched, and we ate sandwiches my son made, because apparently he'd learned to cook somewhere along the way, without telling me. At some point, Eli looked over and said, "I think Grandpa knew we'd figure it out." I said, "Yeah, I think he did too." We watched the rest of the movie. The good guy won. The credits rolled. Outside, the Ohio dark came in slow and quiet over the street, and the house held us the same way it always had, the same way my father built it to.